In 1946, the U.S. Treasury Department requested an explanation from the State Department regarding the Soviet Union's reluctance to join the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, as well as its recent behavior. At that time, diplomat George Kennan, stationed in Moscow, sent a 5,500-word telegram from Moscow to U.S. Secretary of State James Burns on February 22, 1946, outlining Soviet foreign policy. This telegram was the longest ever written up to that time. Hence, it was informally called the Long Telegram. Officially designated as 511, the telegram was divided into 5 parts covering the Soviet Union's background, current characteristics, future expectations, and their implications for the United States. It opened with an apology for its length, but Kennan sought to address all urgent concerns at once. The ideas in Kennan's long telegram were not new, but the arguments he presented and the vivid language he used came at just the right moment. Kennan began by presenting the world through the Soviet perspective, dividing it into socialist and capitalist sectors. According to the Soviet viewpoint, the alliance between the United States and Britain was doomed to fail. Such an alliance would either result in a war between them or a joint attack on the Soviet Union. The Soviets believed that in such a conflict, they would eventually prevail. However, in the meantime, they needed to strengthen themselves and exploit the internal tensions among capitalist nations. Kennan rejected these ideas as nonsense, pointing out that capitalist countries were not inherently doomed to fail and were not always in conflict. He also labeled the idea that the United States and Britain would intentionally go to war with the Soviets as sheer nonsense. According to Kennan, beneath the Kremlin's neurotic worldview of global affairs lay a deep-rooted and instinctive Russian sense of insecurity. Following the Russian Revolution, this sense of insecurity fused with communist ideology and the Eastern tradition of secrecy. Soviet foreign behavior was primarily driven by the internal necessities of Joseph Stalin's regime. Kennan argued that Stalin needed a hostile world to legitimize his autocratic rule. Kennan called the challenge of dealing with Soviet communism undoubtedly the greatest task our diplomacy has ever faced. In the first 2 sections, he introduced key concepts that would later form the foundation of American Cold War policy. According to Kennan, the Soviets viewed themselves as being in constant conflict with capitalism. They considered leftist but non-communist groups in other countries as worse enemies than capitalists. They would use controllable Marxists in the capitalist world as allies. Soviet aggression was not driven by the will of the Russian people or economic logic, but by a mix of Russian nationalism and neurosis. The structure of the Soviet government prevented an objective or accurate picture of both internal and external realities. Kennan argued that the Soviet Union saw no possibility of peaceful coexistence with the capitalist world. Their permanent goal was to advance the socialist cause. Capitalism was seen as a threat to socialism, and capitalists could not be trusted nor allowed to influence Soviet citizens. Kennan was certain the Soviets would try to expand their spheres of influence and identified Iran and Turkey as possible target zones. In the 5th section, Kennan outlined Soviet weaknesses and proposed strategy for the U.S. Despite significant challenges, he believed that control remained in American hands and that the issue could be resolved without a general military conflict. He believed the Soviet Union was sensitive to power, weak in comparison to the united Western world, vulnerable to internal instability, and that its propaganda was primarily negative and destructive. The solution, according to Kennan, was not confrontation, but containment, strengthening Western institutions against Soviet pressure and surrounding the Soviets to prevent expansion. The long telegram was quickly read by Washington officials and was considered the best explanation of Soviet behavior at the time. Policymakers, military leaders, and intelligence analysts largely agreed that the Soviet Union's main foreign policy aim was to dominate the world under a communist regime. The Truman administration accepted Kennan's view that the Soviets would never genuinely cooperate with the West. Therefore, trying to create policies to alleviate Soviet concerns was deemed pointless. George Kennan gained prominence as an expert on Soviet affairs. Although the long telegram was classified, it circulated widely, and a copy reached Soviet intelligence. Stalin himself was among its readers and asked the Soviet ambassador in Washington, Nikolai Novikov, to send a similar telegram from Washington to Moscow. On January 7, 1947, Kennan spoke at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York City. The topic of the meeting was Soviet foreign relations. In his speech, he discussed how Soviet leaders viewed the rest of the world through the lens of both communist and Russian historical traditions. According to Kennan, the Soviets justified their dictatorship by pointing to mostly imaginary foreign enemies. For real change to happen, the US and its allies had to contain the Soviets in a non-provocative manner. A businessman in the audience, impressed by the speech, asked Kennan to turn it into an article. Kennan wrote the article expanding his views but signed it anonymously with the letter X. Hence, it became widely known as the X article. It was published in the July 1947 issue of Foreign Affairs magazine under the title The Sources of Soviet Conduct. According to Kennan, the Soviets were not ready to launch an immediate attack to overthrow the West. Their ideology implied that capitalism would collapse on its own over time. Instead, their long-term goal was to gradually fill every power vacuum that appeared around the world. To resist this, the U.S. needed long-term strategies to contain Soviet expansionist ambitions. Kennan proposed a policy of counterforce applied at shifting geographical and political pressure points around the Soviet periphery. This concept, that not all regions were equally important, led to the perimeter defense strategy, advising the U.S. to stand firm wherever Soviet pressure appeared. Containment, Kennan argued, would prove successful in the long run, because the Soviet economy was primitive and lacked succession procedures for future leaders. Any disruption in the Soviet political system carried the possibility of the most powerful society turning overnight into the weakest. Kennan also argued that the U.S. would have to carry out this containment strategy largely on its own, but if it could do so without harming its economic health and political stability, the immense pressure within the Soviet system would eventually cause fragmentation. The publication of the X article sparked major debates in American foreign policy circles. The telegram and the article prompted the Truman administration to adopt a harder stance toward the Soviets rather than pursuing diplomacy. Stalin's aggressive behavior toward Iran and Turkey in 1945-46 further strengthened support for a firm resistance policy. These views laid the foundation of America's Cold War diplomacy. George Kennan's diplomatic career accelerated after this. In 1952, he was appointed U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union. After retiring from public service, Kennan continued to teach at the Institute for Advanced Study until his death in 2005 at the age of 101.